So we are currently going to be talking about sort of course level, and the reason why for this presentation is I currently work as the curriculum coordinator at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock in the provost office. And technically my title is curriculum coordinator and special projects manager. And what that commonly comes to mean is if anything comes up, I get to be the scapegoat for you can do that, right? I don't know if any of you come from a rhetoric and composition background, but I have often found there's a couple of us in this office actually. I've often found that if something comes up, there is the assumption that you know how to write, so you're going to be able to do this too. And it's sort of how assessment came to fall into my lap. It's how I came to be involved with program reviews and accreditation. But the reason I'm really looking now at sort of course level and thinking about revising rubrics specifically for writing process is teaching is what keeps me motivated and I suppose keeps me in higher education. I'm sure you have all experienced something close to burnout, but being able to go into a classroom and interact with my students is what keeps me motivated. But just as a brief background, I've been teaching in higher education since 2014. I've been teaching in general since 2011, where I started at a small rural secondary high school. Um, and today I'm going to be talking about using assessment to address AI use in the writing classroom while overcoming the divide between teaching process, which we often do, and assessing product. To give you a brief overview of where we're going, just so that you kind of have your expectations in line, I'm going to start off by just sort of establishing my personal stake, I guess, giving you my available heuristic on why this matters to me, where I'm coming from, and then I will give you some background on process. Just, if there are any people here who aren't familiar with the way writing instruction has gone and where we're at now, you'll get some background and some history there. We will look at the AI angle, where we'll kind of talk about how that's maybe complicating things. We'll examine some strategies for resolution, and then we'll do a synthesis activity there towards the end, where hopefully we can sort of come together and work on maybe developing a rubric for process work based on everything that we do here. And then I'm kind of hoping for maybe more room there at the end of this presentation so that we have an opportunity to talk to one another, because one of the things that I've been doing is going through the AAC&U AI Institute as a team lead for the UA Little Rock. And some of the most productive conversations I've found that have happened during that institute have, we've learned some really great things through some of the conference presentations themselves, but getting to talk to one another and find out what we're doing or maybe some thoughts that we have has felt really rewarding. So I'm hoping for some time there at the end where we're able to do that with one another. And to start, our first activity here is I'm asking for, and this will create kind of a word wall, what words come to mind when you think about your past experiences in a writing course? You should be able to enter in some responses there on whatever device that you're using if you're connected. You're welcome to do it as an instructor, but I'm also thinking here primarily as a student. How has it felt for you in the past as a student? Frustrating, formal, not black and white, creativity, overwhelming. I like to see fun there. It's sort of interesting as you're putting these through, I'm seeing some buzzwords that have already been throughout my presentation. So I feel like whatever it is that I'm thinking is going in the right way. So yeah, not black and white, vague, frustrating, challenging, time consuming. I do like that we're getting a little bit here of fun and vague, or fun and vague, fun and good. Those are positive. I like the positives. Um, I usually ask my students this the first day of class when we start a composition class. And so not yesterday, Wednesday was our first class day, and I'm teaching Composition 1 this semester in person. So I asked my students that, and I got a completely new and unusual response from them. We'll talk about it a little bit more later, but for the first time yesterday, almost every single student in my class had something positive to say about their writing experience in a class. They were all very positive and excited about it, and they had had really good experiences. But we'll talk about this later. There was a problem with their very good experiences that I did not anticipate, but probably should have. So I want to give you a little bit of background into why I have a personal stake in this, or sort of why it matters to me and how I came to be, maybe you could say, radicalized in my pedagogy. To start with, I, when I graduated college, began teaching at a small rural southern high school, and I was teaching English. And at the time, I had, because it was such a small school, I was the only secondary education or secondary English teacher there. I had ninth grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade English. I also had to teach debate and speech, and I had two AP courses, and all of those occurred in the same day. So it wasn't, set up like a block schedule. Every single one of those courses occurred in the same day. So when all of you talked of, or when a few of you maybe mentioned feeling like you were overwhelmed in a writing course, I was very overwhelmed as a first time teacher, having that many courses to prepare for, and not really having any set lesson plans or anything going into it. So everything was from scratch. And it was very much a, be thrown to the wolves and find out what you can do experience. And while I was there, part of, I suppose, what radicalized me is, we hear this expectation that we're teaching towards standardized testing in secondary education. And I found that to be quite true. Uh, and it sort of led into part of why I left, because I was able to connect really well with my students, and I discovered that treating them like a person and interacting with them as people made them better students in my class, such that my students usually were, if other teachers at the school would complain about certain students, but those same students would be the ones who would ask you, will you come watch me play basketball? And if I would go and I would watch them play basketball after they asked, because it seemed like a really, small request on their end. And a lot of them would be people who maybe they didn't have anyone else coming up to, showing up to watch them. They would be model students in my class. They would pay attention, they would try, but the ways that they were trying would not be reflected in success in something like a standardized test, because I was teaching in a small rural school. Most of my students were, socioeconomically disadvantaged. They didn't come from an opportunity to have a really robust learning experience, and that was reflected in what they were able to do in the class. So I would want to teach them things that maybe they hadn't learned. So I had a lot of students who didn't know how to, organize their thoughts into a logical pattern, or how to make their paragraphs unified such that they're really focusing on one main idea. And attempting to teach them that would be met with scrutiny from the administration, because they should already know how to do that, and I should be moving on to teach them higher level things. But as you all know, we can't teach the higher levels until those foundations are already there and solid. Moving on from that, I started teaching in 2014 developmental writing at a higher education institution. And when I started there, we had legacy rubrics already established, and those were primarily focused on sentence level corrections, which was an interesting thing to encounter. When I started teaching, I was teaching alongside some fellow faculty who didn't look very kindly on developmental writing or on their students in general, because I was at an institution where most of our students were first gen, they were second language learners, they were all predominantly socioeconomically disadvantaged because of the area, because it was also quite rural. And just like when I was teaching in high school, most of the assessment was targeted towards an end result, towards producing something that was polished. But the idea of something being polished can be very foreign to students like those that we had. Just to give you an example of some of the ways that some of my peers were thinking, I had one in particular who would call the spring semester, if a student had to retake Composition 1 or had to retake developmental writing, which there was called basic English, which is its own problem. But I had some peers who would call those trailer park sessions or sections, implying that, of course, those students didn't belong in the ivory tower as that particular peer saw it. And also, they had complaints that in the past 10 years, only one student who had gone through developmental writing had actually managed to graduate from the university, which I fully relate back to that idea of when they're going through developmental writing, they're focusing on that sentence level correction, which will not resonate with those students. But I can confidently say, based on personal experience and just knowing some of my students, that I taught there from 2014 to 2022, and I now have dozens of students who not only graduated since that time, but are currently or have already passed through their master's degree programs. So I know that switching up the way that that is being taught and going from sentence level to process work works works really well for developmental students, especially. And the final thing that I want to mention is just what we're doing on our campus. I'm involved with like I mentioned earlier, the AAC&U AI Institute, where we're developing an action plan, and we're really focusing on our campus on first getting out our policies, and second, developing workshops for faculty to help them feel comfortable with AI literacy, ethics, and having the syllabus language. Um, that all just sort of gives you an invitation to understand where I'm coming from establishing this. And then I want to move into giving you sort of a historical background on where writing instruction has come from and where it's going. To start with, there was an early emphasis on product and correctness in writing instruction. So early to mid 20th century, writing instruction was usually formalist and focused on the analysis of published texts rather than the practice of writing itself. Writing was viewed as a skill to be measured by mechanics and organization rather than as a creative act of invention. Textbooks would emphasize elements like choosing a subject, patterns of development, purposeful detail, and outlining. There was a strong focus on the final product and on correctness, with less attention paid to the writing process. Not that this matters, but this was usually called current traditional pedagogy. Moving from there, we have a shift towards process. So around the 70s, you have scholars like Peter Elbow, who begin to emphasize the importance of teaching students to write by writing. Process-based pedagogy became the standard model, emphasizing invention, revision, and collaboration. This approach encourages students to produce papers in several stages with feedback at every stage. It stresses the recursivity of writing, which is just where writers repeatedly revisit and revise their ideas. So ideally, we're looking at it as a process that evolves over time, but it's not linear. You're constantly going back and thinking, maybe my invention strategy wasn't so great because as I'm getting to drafting, I'm finding out I don't have enough to say. So you're constantly going back and revising. Um, we've had some critiques of looking at process work, especially moving towards something like post-process, which if any of you are familiar with queer theory, I like to think it sort of integrates with queer theory and looking at a deconstruction of it and thinking that maybe process work is too rigid, but a lot of times that relies on a view of process work that isn't fully integrated with that recursive strategy of making sure you're going back and not looking at it as linear. That's usually that critique I've found is really critiquing a very linear thought of you move from invention to drafting to revision to your complete, which is, as we know, not really how writing works, especially not good writing. Uh, Something else that I think has been really good that's come out of process pedagogy is focusing more on formative assessment instead of just summative assessment. However, even within the current structure, we're still have a strong focus on summative, particularly as regards to rubrics, which creates this tension between process and product because we spend so much time in our classroom really focusing on the value of process and teaching students, whether it be through workshop style or a flipped classroom approach. Process is the be all end all. And then when it comes to the rubric, we're really kind of asking them to show mastery in an end product, even though that has not been the emphasis throughout the actual teaching and learning. And what this sort of leaves us with are student perceptions that don't quite match. So students will often internalize the value of the rubric. So they'll feel very much how do I get the good grade? How do I avoid the bad grade? So they're less focused on actually getting to develop the process, being inquisitive and trying and failing and being comfortable with failing because they're really sort of looking at their education and their attempts here in the learning process as sort of risk management strategy. Because I mentioned this earlier when I taught at the high school level, students look at and are trained to see their education so far as this as a risk management strategy. How do I avoid the worst case scenario, particularly when it's tied to funding and you have students who, if they lose their funding, they lose their access to education. Not making a good grade means I'm no longer going to be able to be involved in my own education. So students, when presented with a rubric that really focuses on that end product, uh, are really learning more how do I master the rubric and not how do I write well. So the valuable characteristics of discovery and critical thinking give way to the risk management style of learning. So many of our students are already predisposed to functioning. The risk of a bad grade prevents exploring and challenging within student writing and creates of our writers and communicators the very kind of robots that we kind of fear with AI, who are really only capable of responding to a given prompt and for a given rubric, but do not have those nuances in their communication to confront a novel problem comfortably. Um, I also sort of think of this in terms of, most of us are probably using things like Amazon or we're booking on Airbnb. If we see a product or, we're trying to plan a vacation, we're really looking for 5-star reviews. Anything below a 5-star review, something is wrong there, and we're probably not going to book it. We're probably not going to order it. Students are viewing their grades in the same way. Anything less than a complete 100% score is showing them a decreased return on investment. I put in so much work, but I make a 95. So it's disproportionately viewed as a failure, even if, for most of us, when we're looking at it as educators, that's a great score. And it just says that you have a little bit more improvement to make. The student isn't looking at it in terms of, I have a little bit more improvement to make. They're looking at it more in terms of, I am incapable here. Something bad has happened. And they're not always necessarily looking at the feedback that's being given to them so much as they're thinking primarily about the grade. Melissa, thank you for coming. Good luck with your furniture delivery. Um, and finally, I want to sort of look at a couple of examples together just to show you, although I'm sure most of you are already familiar with rubrics and what they're going to look like. So here I've pulled one from our Composition 1 class, and this is looking specifically at a personal photo narrative where students are usually walking through their experience with literacy, and they're attaching photos and providing vignettes with those photos. But this is still focusing again on the end product. And I don't view this as a bad rubric. So as I present these rubrics, I'm not suggesting that anything that's happening here is necessarily bad. It's just that it isn't focusing on the process, and so it's providing pitfalls for students. So for example, with a title, students are asked to provide something that's original and interesting. It is very difficult, however, for students to really interact with what is original or interesting, because that becomes subjective. So they're looking at this rubric, and not only is it really predetermining based on the end result, the end product, it's also providing them with sort of vague language of what am I really aiming for? But if any of you are interested in maybe turning off your mics or communicating in chat, is there anything else that you maybe see here with this rubric that provides an example of we're focusing on end product, but maybe not rewarding the process to get there? Yep, I see their audience engagement, encouraging connection. Yeah, it feels kind of vague. And how do I really comfortably and reliably get to that point such that I'm earning the grade that I think I hope to earn? Leaves the audience with a clear sense of the project's purpose. That really seems like something where you're really more assessing the audience, right? Difficult for a student to really achieve that or to determine for themselves how they can be successful there. Often, yes, that would be communicated in a lecture or course material. However, we can't necessarily reliably say that the professor has given the students what they need to say that, yes, I know exactly what it means to leave the audience with a clear sense of the project's purpose. And looking at something like a rubric, we're also looking at something that lives on and is capable to be accessed repeatedly. Whereas if it's discussed one time in class and is no longer to be accessed repeatedly, it leaves a kind of vulnerability there for the student to not have something really concrete to look at and examine. But I think many of these things could still be addressed and just maybe have slightly tighter language that gives students exactly what they need there. This one I pulled from North Carolina State University. And again, I'm not looking at like tearing down these rubrics. I'm not suggesting these are bad rubrics. They're not. They provide a lot of good information that rubrics prior to this particular time period were not giving students anyway. But here, for example, to find out whether or not something is provides clarity, central purpose of the student work is clear and supporting ideas always well focused. Details are relevant and enrich the work. So between above average and sufficient, we get the central purpose of the student work is clear and ideas are almost always focused in a way that supports the thesis. Relevant details illustrate the author's work. Any ideas here about something that maybe focuses primarily on end product but doesn't reward students for process work? Yeah, the no grammar errors. Yeah, focusing on correctness and the mechanics there can really devalue a lot of student work because especially for first year students, mastering mechanics is almost unfathomable. I get graduate students who are not quite at that point yet. It's a constantly evolving and changing thing, and it really prioritizes students who have a familiarity to or familiarity with and an access to standardized academic English. And particularly where I have taught in the past, that's not something that's really accessible. The word slightly can present problems. Logical presentation order, yes. And I get that, providing something like logical presentation order allows for some wiggle room, but it's still, if a student is trying to look at this as though this is what I need to do in order to avoid the greatest risk to my grade, how do I determine exactly what's logical? So I'm curious to see if you can share any opinions of your own or that you've heard from peers about embracing or rejecting AI use in the classroom as we move. I'll give you an example. I uh, I have had faculty sort of to tell me that with Grammarly, what do students really need me for anyway? So I've had some faculty who are really sort of disparaged by the idea that an AI could replicate or replace the feedback that they're giving. So they're really looking at it as a it or me kind of product. And you're welcome to either respond in chat or you can share through the Menti app if you like. Many, I think, don't allow it because they themselves are not familiar with the technology. I think that is quite true. Sort of ironically, maybe. We talk with our students a lot and we try to get them comfortable with the idea of embracing something unfamiliar so that they learn. I think that's exactly what's happening with faculty who come up against AI and they want to reject it because they don't want to interact with it. But, being uncomfortable with something, learning something, that's exactly what we're asking our students to do repeatedly. And I think it is a fair ask for us to engage with AI, not necessarily to suggest that you have to use it all the time in your classroom, but just to have the awareness of it, to understand what's going on there. The discussion questions have become a joke. Everything is run through AI, so answers are the same. I wonder if that's particularly with something like an online class. Do you feel it's important for students to learn skills first before they rely on something else too heavily? Also, it's a real challenge as an online instructor to allow any AI use without students using it wholesale. That can be really difficult to navigate. We've had mixed reviews. Some think words. Some think AI will lessen critical thinking skills. Some feel it can be used as a tool to generate ideas. I'm also kind of tired of the Grammarly and turn it in extension. Looking here at what we've gotten on Menti, sort of mixed for using AI as a tool, as long as it's properly cited. Many reject it completely, but I think they're going to have to know how to use it. Does it work? To embrace it, but I'm wondering where the lines are with the tools when we are teaching writing. I like these so far. I am going to sort of move us on to talking more broadly about the AI angle. So we already know that this is being developed and used in most, if not all, aspects of life. As I already told you, I've heard some faculty say that they're sort of starting to feel like maybe they don't matter anymore, or they're just sort of questioning what the point is. I've also, and I will say I've not seen this in composition courses, but I have encountered some faculty who take a student's writing that they turn in, they put it into Grammarly, and whatever grade Grammarly gives it is the grade the student gets. And what feedback Grammarly gives it is the feedback that that professor gives the student. So I've seen a student get an 88% on an assignment because that's what Grammarly would have given it. And again, I've not seen this in composition classrooms, particularly the two instances that I'm thinking of were in the sciences, and they were for an assignment that um, the course was not hinged upon. Student learning outcomes were being assessed, but not the major student learning outcomes. But I still think this creates sort of a muddy slope. And it also leans into the idea of that faculty who's really worried that Grammarly is replacing them. In this situation, the faculty is letting Grammarly replace them. So I'm sure they probably did it because they felt like it was an easier way and a quicker way to provide feedback, but it is sort of devaluing your own role in the student learning process. Looking at new challenges, we also have to start thinking about if we're going to allow AI use, we have to make sure that we have sections in our class where we are talking about how to use it ethically, how to have AI literacy, which would include something like teaching students how to develop, to do prompt engineering, to make sure that students are understanding that these AI tools are only as good as we allow them to be. They're only as good as what we put into them. Um, but sort of thinking positively, there's a lot of potential with using AI because it can give really detailed and immediate feedback to students. And it can do it in a way that feels less judgmental because they're not talking to another person. It doesn't have a face. It's technically kind of a robot. There's no sense of judgment there. Uh, it can also do a good job of analyzing and providing summaries for students who maybe struggle with long reading. It There's some really important tools online that I think help sort of level the playing field for students, particularly maybe students who standard academic English is not immediately accessible to them. AI can be great, particularly as a reading tool, maybe even more so than a writing tool. But it's also great at doing things like helping students with the invention stage of writing, at the drafting stage, providing them with some different options. Because a lot of times I find that our students struggle with understanding what is possible. And AI can really help them navigate to and have options for what is possible when they're sort of struggling to figure out where they can go, what avenues they have. And one example of that is, I don't know how many of you have been keeping up with this, but Arizona State University has started to use a lot of AI tools in their writing courses. And one of the things that I have heard them talk about is that students will use, I think the app is called WordTune, but you have to provide writing first. It won't necessarily just create it for you. But what it will do is it will give you some different options. And they say that they find that students will do a number of different things with those options. One student might put something into WordTune and find that WordTune has given him three different options. And maybe they decide that they do like one of the options. They say that that is the least likely thing to occur. Another one is that a student will get those three different options back and say, actually, you know what? All of these three different options, I didn't like any of them. I'm going to stay with what I originally wrote because I believe in my work. And they also will have students who kind of create a Frankenstein's monster out of them, and where they get the three different options and they like something different from all of them that maybe expands on what they weren't able to do in their original draft. And so they sort of pick and choose And the really important thing there is to make sure that when students are doing that, we're giving them the tools to cite it and to show the maybe through metacognitive work like reflection, how they're using it and how they came to decide I like these three individual things that I pulled out of here and put into my own work. And here's why I thought it was already missing from what I was doing. But I think one of the things that we really have to keep in mind when we're thinking about AI in general is that there is sort of a generational shift that's occurring. And I haven't seen this talked about a lot, but I have heard it a little, and I hear my students talk about it a lot, where especially post-pandemic, there's an increase in sort of mental health issues. There's an increase in students feeling a strong sense of isolation. And with that, they are often turning to AI tools like Replica or Character.ai, and they're developing sort of quasi relationships with AI tools because it provides them a sense to escape that isolation. And through this, I think there is something to be said for students developing a sense that AI can navigate itself through multiple facets of their life. I mean, of course, we're already seeing this with different industries that are including AI in just about everything they do. Hiring managers are increasingly saying that they want students to have AI skills, although I'm not seeing a ton of evidence to show that those hiring managers know what those AI skills are. They're just saying that they want students who have those. But with students already interacting with it and involving it in multiple ways throughout their life, including these ways like treating it like emotional support, I think it is really important that we sort of think about this idea here that I have at the bottom, which we discuss a lot in that AI Institute, is making sure that there's still a human in the loop and a human at the wheel, which it's, we need to be able to guide students through this process work and emphasize its value, through rubrics and assessment, because it just better helps them to see AI as a tool that's used when it's best used when the human is kept in the loop, because AI is great at a lot of things. It can be. It's not great at nuance. It's not great at necessarily fully understanding context. And of course, we still have tons of hallucinations that occur. But keeping a human in the loop and making sure that a human is really guiding it is what's going to help us prevent getting to that point that most people are worried about, where AI is going to take over everything, which I think is a little bit of a fear reaction. But I also think acknowledging that and engaging with it is how we avoid that happening in the first place. So, thinking about strategies for resolution here, as we look back at being more process focused in our assessment, in our rubrics, we're going to have to incorporate more process artifacts. So I'm thinking here specifically, um, I was looking at like anthropology studies, for example, to have something like field notes so that students are constantly keeping track of where they're going with whatever they're doing with AI, or even if they're not involving AI, still keeping those process notes, those field notes for how they are moving throughout the invention stage and the drafting stage. Show me what you're doing instead of just letting me sort of assume, or letting me see a final product that could or could not have been created by AI, but I don't have those little markers that tell me how it developed. Um, that would also include, and I've done this with students when I use AI assignments, including screenshots and prompt logs so that we can see where that process went with the actual AI tool, including multiple drafts, which a lot of writing instructors have been doing for years anyway, because they want to see how the student developed. But along with those multiple drafts, having the field notes and having metacognitive work like reflective writing shows us not only where the student got from point A to point B, but walks us through their timeline and their thought process of how they got there. And that further deepens their actual access to the learning. And it allows them to retain it for longer. Something else that I really like, we're a Google campus. And being a Google campus, one thing that is really accessible to us is the Google Docs. So with Google Docs, and I think with a couple of other software that are writing processors, you can see all of the changes that happen over time, such that, it allows you to see if they're copy and pasting, or if they are, pulling huge chunks from somewhere else And it allows you to see also where they're kind of going through and their ideas are changing and they're developing and growing. Something else that is really great is making it collaborative. So allowing students to have a stake in the development of the rubric, letting them kind of help you decide what will really show to me or show your competency in a given skill. It allows students to better access the language of a rubric. It allows students to have a sense of agency and ownership in what they're doing. And it also gives you a better insight as the instructor into what they think is important already so that you can help guide them to what is going to actually showcase that they have this competency, that they have this skill. Something else that is going to be great is student-led presentations of process work. I've noticed a lot of people kind of talking about how this is really difficult in an online class, and it absolutely is. In addition to teaching composition in person, I also have an online class that I teach with concurrent students. And in that class, I have them do these student-led presentations of process work where they are guiding me through either a voice notes in Blackboard or an actual video presentation that they upload. I ask them to guide me through their process, to walk me through in their own language, in their own voice. Here's what I did. Here was my thought process while I was doing it, so that they're taking those field notes, those screenshots, and they're building a timeline of their own thought process and how they got to the end result. One thing that I have started to do this with students is because I noticed such a trend in building characters on character.ai and interacting with them. I teach a literature course and I started to involve that in the literature course, such that I had students build a character from a specific novel that we read. So they're doing character analysis, they're building the actual AI tool, and they're communicating with it to determine whether or not the AI character that they built responds in a way that matches the character analysis that they performed from the novel. Well, it steps out of the writing development, but it retains that sense of maintaining the process work because they're providing me the notes that they make as they're doing the analysis work. They're providing me screenshots and prompt logs, and they're doing that metacognitive reflective work of explaining how they got there and what the effect was that occurred after they had built this AI machine. A third strategy here is making sure that the assessment that you're doing is formative, such that you're allowing it to occur all throughout the course and it's not just happening there towards the actual end when you get to that end result. And that really just also helps you sort of clue into how students are developing throughout the process, in addition to helping us to ensure that the fears that we have about AI aren't also creeping into what we're actually doing with our assessment. Another thing that I have liked, that I have found through this, is adaptively released assessment feedback. Some of you may already be doing this or have heard about it, but essentially adaptively released assessment feedback is playing off this idea that when we give students feedback, they're really aiming straight for looking at that grade. And whatever the grade is what takes precedent. And whatever is necessarily happening in the feedback maybe isn't getting much attention from the students. And I think this owes to a couple of different uh, issues, such that, leading out of something like high school education where students are getting still those really sentence level corrections, students are thinking, well, if I look through the actual feedback, it's just going to tell me I didn't put a comma where I was supposed to put it. And I don't know that students necessarily have the language to communicate this, but I do know that students recognize that that's not actually going to help them be a better writer. And so they sort of gloss over it and they think, back to that risk management style of learning, I just need to know what grade I got. However, with the adaptively released assessment feedback, you're giving them the feedback first. You're asking them to interact with that feedback in some way, whether it be reflective writing, and then they're not getting the grade until after they have interacted with that feedback. And getting the grade could then mean that the grade goes up based on how they interact with the feedback that you've given them, such that, maybe you ask them some open-ended question there about trying to find out, well, why did you make this choice? Because one of the things that we know about good writing is that good writing involves decision making. And so finding out why they made the certain decisions that they did better helps us determine how they're really working through that process work. So moving ahead, I had planned kind of a synthesis activity for us, but I think to make it slightly less involved than I was initially planning, because I don't know that we have time to really like form a full rubric necessarily, I do want to find out from you, what competencies would you want to see students achieving on a process-focused writing rubric? So where would you want your to know for a fact, my students are going to have a skill in this particular area? I really need to see this to know that they are doing well in the invention stage or the drafting stage or the revision stage. And if you kind of feel like, you know what, I'm not really a writing professor, maybe I don't have a background here for this, feel free to just kind of to riff off of it, to kind of play around and just talk about what you would like to see in a rubric, even in your own discipline, where you're thinking more process focused and you're trying to think, how do I keep the human in the assessment when AI is so present? Using evidence to support an argument. I would also like to see students finding a way to show that they know that the evidence they've provided actually supports their argument, such that it's not just there, but maybe they also have a little field note where they're telling me, here's why I know that the quote that I've used here is actually relevant to what I'm saying. Information literacy, absolutely. Critical thinking that brings together the basic information learned. Yes. Especially with the critical thinking there, I think we can really get that strongly through reflective work. Really like to focus on structure. I want to see clear argument and logical progression, like that. I'll tell you one thing. I back when I was teaching our version of Composition 2, which primarily focuses more on argument and research, one of the things that I had students do, and this was earlier in the course, was something called an iSearch paper. I don't know if that's like a familiar term or not, but the iSearch paper essentially asks students to do essentially this process work. They're doing all of the research as they're preparing for a research paper. But instead of writing the research paper that they expect, the iSearch paper describes how they followed their research, how their ideas developed and changed because of the research, or didn't. And it really asks them to do this exactly what we're talking about here, the process and the reflective work of following their ideas before later we get to a project where they're actually doing the research report there at the end. See, making an argument instead of telling a story, personal growth in writing competency over the semester. I like that. I also like that I mean, if you are looking at summative assignments, there at the end of the semester, having reflective writing where a student follows their own growth and showcases through citing themselves, here's where I think I have displayed growth. Because I think it's fascinating and it gives students a greater sense of agency to show where they think they've grown. Demonstrating higher level understanding versus just memorizing and regurgitating information. Yes, I am very much not a fan of the banking theory of knowledge where you just necessarily have to regurgitate something that you learned at one point in your life. I also have this quick activity here where when I was looking at potentially building a rubric, I was thinking, what kinds of things might I like to see, especially if it's an assignment where I know they're going to be using AI? And I've done these when I had originally put these on here, they were in alphabetical order, although they're not now, which is fun. But I have here an opportunity for you to kind of rank the six provided competencies from higher order concern to lower. Um, and if I was going to look at something like this, I was thinking I might consider AI engagement. So how did they engage the AI? How did they show me that they engaged the AI? Looking at student ownership, so ownership of their own ideas, documentation of process work. Do they actually provide the documentation? Is it relevant to what they're doing? Ethical and academic integrity, and reflection and revision. I like this so far. I think, especially if you're going to spend time in class focusing on what it means to have ethical and academic integrity in relation to use of AI, that has to be something that you really strongly consider. So I like that we get that up there at the top. I also think that ownership is possibly one of the most important things here too, because ideally, as we're getting students to work on their writing, one of the most difficult things is to get students to feel an ownership in what they're doing, which is ironic because a lot of times when we ask students, what do you like most about your writing class? Or what have been your favorite opportunities to engage with writing? It's usually, oh, it's when I get to pick my own topic, which shows us that they do care about and have a mind to ownership. But a lot of times in the writing classroom, there is that disconnect between what they want to have that ownership, and what they actually feel, which is, I have to perform for this rubric, and doing that means that maybe I'm not doing exactly what I want to do. Maybe I'm not really exploring everything that I could, but I know that I have to get a good grade, such that it sort of devalues the ownership there. But I find, at least in my experience, that giving students that ownership is what really makes them better writers. It makes them feel like they're better writers. Uh, as I'm sort of wrapping up here, just a few final thoughts, which is this turn in assessment centers the assessment event on the learning and the learner rather than a golden final product that may not necessarily reflect competency. It may instead reflect a learned approach to producing a desired outcome based on a history of following rubrics. However, when presented with a problem with no known rubric, the confidence of a student thus far succeeding at performing for a set standard will falter. When the equation changes, a student with a robust writing process whose learning focuses on the ability to write, challenge, experiment, and even fail will have built strategies to overcome and be able to self-evaluate and direct in an otherwise unfamiliar environment. So, and also sort of for those of us who maybe aren't coming from a writing background, in turning this method away from the writing classroom, I think it also provides a challenge for other disciplines to remember to keep a human in the loop or keep a human at the wheel. When redesigning assessments with AI in mind, remember to look for those spaces where AI cannot replicate humanity. What can we really assess from our students that they are doing, or that they can show us that they're doing, that AI couldn't? So it's really an opportunity there to sort of look for nuances, look for things that AI just has not gotten to the point where they can do. But with that there, I'd like to open it up for the Q&A, or just to give us an opportunity to talk to one another about our struggles. Like I know, for example, we're talking about struggling with an online class. That is something I hear a lot, and it is something that I also completely agree with. So anyone with solutions, I would love to hear more about. I absolutely can send you along some example process rubrics. Let me make a note of that. I'll also provide here my email so you can reach out to me. A, just feel free to talk to me. Love that. But B, if you would like to request anything that I have worked on or produced, I am more than happy to send along. I fully believe in the collaborative process of helping us all get on board with something. Any large suggestions for online instructors and AI use? I can tell you that one of the things that I have started to employ, and I'll send you this along as well when I send you the process rubrics that I have, is there's a website online where students can actually get a certificate for, I think it's about a 4-hour training that students can do that gives them a background in AI literacy and also in ethical usage. I like to give that to my students because then I know that in addition to what I discuss with them in class or discuss with them through various ways online, they're getting kind of a follow-up there. So that's one step that I like to make sure also kind of gets helped along. Especially I give that resource to faculty who aren't yet comfortable talking to their students about it because they're still trying to get on board themselves, which completely understandable. It feels so new and we have so many things to do anyway. But the other suggestion that I have that has worked for me, and I guess that's really the only way I can give a suggestion, is kind of like I mentioned with the literacy course that I have. Because right now, the only thing that I'm really teaching online is literacy, but we do a lot of writing in that class, just because that's my main background. And with that, I still have them do the process work, and I have them do the part where they're explaining to me how they're doing what they're doing. And I try to emphasize for those students when I'm preparing them for to do the delivery of that presentation of their work. I try to stress for them that I'm not judging how well they are organizing and presenting that information at that time. I want to really see them walk me through their process, even if it involves trial and error, if it involves failure. I want to see the students showcasing to me the effort involved there in learning. Because when they're talking to me about here's where I started, here's where I struggled, I find that students, when you make it accessible and easy for them to talk about where they struggle, it's easier for them to A, get over the struggle, but B, to talk to you about it in a sort of vulnerable and open way. Um, I don't know if that's useful, but I would be more than happy to continue this conversation and keep going on email or otherwise. Um, I would also say that if any of you are interested, I would be more than willing to share a Google file of all the different sort of research papers that have been involved in my brain while I'm thinking about this and sort of moving forward. I feel like a Google folder or something similar is just a really easy way to say, here's what I used. Please feel free to access. Otherwise, I hope all of you get to enjoy the rest of the symposium. I'm looking forward to it myself. Thank you all for being so interactive. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.